Thank you, Regina, and thanks to the organizers for permitting us to make this presentation today. We're very pleased to do it. And thanks to all the attendees for attending the session. I am the executive director of CLOCKSS, and I'm retiring in 2 weeks. So we are fortunate to have Alicia Wise succeeding me as executive director, and she will be giving most of the CLOCKSS presentation today. We're going to start with some words about digital preservation using CLOCKSS as the example, and then we're going to move to Jasmine Mulliken speaking about some advanced publishing examples that from the Stanford University Press. So if we move on, first I wanted to talk about why preservation is necessary. Many of you know all this, but I wanted to set the background. In the print world, we all know that many copies exist in many different libraries around the world, so we can be comfortable that the print is being preserved. However, with digital content, normally the users are accessing the content on the publisher's platforms, and the libraries do not have a copy. That's not always the case, but in general. So given that fact, how can libraries and users be sure that digital content will not disappear? And that's where, in effect, a trusted third-party service like CLOCKSS comes into play. And preservation is more than just making a backup copy. It requires active management to make sure that the content data, the bits, are healthy. You also need diversity in organization, governance, and geography to guard against single points of failure. And of course, there needs to be security, the ability to forward migrate the content and to preserve it for the long term. There's a very helpful thing from the National Digital Stewardship Alliance called levels of preservation, because preservation is a spectrum. There are different approaches to preservation. CLOCKSS in general takes the high road. So we can move on. And I have one more slide I wanted to do. Whereas the previous slide was why is preservation necessary, this is why is preservation important. Scholars rely upon ongoing access to the content. They build their content upon the work of colleagues around the world, so they need to be able to reliably access that content and know that if they looked at it yesterday, they can find it again tomorrow. And scholarly literature is valuable over the long term, so scholars need access to it for decades. And the truth is that digital content can disappear from the web. Libraries are really the leading champions for digital preservation, partly built on their history with print, and partly because in a campus environment, librarians are the ones most tuned in to the importance of preservation as stewards of the content resources that they are making available for their communities. And that's what CLOCKSS does. We ensure that the content will be available. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia.
There we go. I think I've managed to unmute now. And we're actually going to have the first 2 of 4 polls at this point. So I hope our facilitators can switch the first poll on. The first question is for all of you. Of the materials you're publishing, what percentage of those is currently preserved? And the second question is a list of preservation services that are sometimes in use by library presses, and we'd be quite keen to know which choices you're using. Thank you very much. Just give you another little bit of time to answer these two questions. We will look at the answers together. Great. I think they seem to be stable at the moment. And the poll results should be visible to you now. That's brilliant. So what percentage of your published materials are preserved? This is good. I'm glad to see that there is no one who's responded 0. And we have a wide array of other answers. And if we scroll down to which of the various digital preservation services you're using, CLOCKSS and LOCKSS, which I'll be talking about for the rest of the presentation, are there. We've also got preservation services Portico, PKP-PN, the National Libraries, AP Trust, Meta Archive, Amazon. Oh, that's really interesting, actually. Let's just scroll down and see if there are others. Fantastic. Okay, that's really helpful information. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to stop sharing the results and we will go on just a little bit. There we go. So preservation options for library publishers are very broad. We've already got a flavor of this. And for example, you will probably want to be thinking about an array of preservation options for your press and its outputs. So some combination, for example, of CLOCKSS, Portico, PKP-PN, or your own library might be your approaches to preservation for your content. If you're using your own library to provide services, there are a number of options, and LOCKSS, for example, is one of these. So I was going to just say a little something about LOCKSS. This is a name for freely available open source software developed at Stanford, which is available to be deployed in your digital library environment. It's also the name for an alliance of the financial supporters that are behind the LOCKSS platform. And it's one of the many names of communities that deploy the LOCKSS software for preservation purposes. So you might hear the global LOCKSS network referred to. And I'm going to be talking mostly tonight about CLOCKSS now, and we use LOCKSS technology to underpin the CLOCKSS service, which is a dark archive for the scholarly record. So about CLOCKSS, we're community owned and governed. We provide a trusted digital archive of the scholarly record. And really important to us is that a service is a collaboration between research libraries and academic publishers around the world. We're a not-for-profit organization, a 501c3 based in the United States, and we have an active global community of more than 300 libraries and 300 publishers. Our mission is to keep the scholarly record safe, or that part of it which we are entrusted with, and we do this by providing a dark archiving service. And the technology we use to deliver that, developed at Stanford, is the LOCKSS software. And we continue to have a very close and special relationship with the Stanford libraries. We have mirror repository sites at major academic institutions around the world. And this means that our approach to digital preservation is designed to be resilient and from threats from potential technological, economic, environmental, or political changes that might take place. We preserve the content entrusted to us in a highly secure environment, which is not accessible to users at all unless a trigger event occurs. And trigger events are where, for some reason, the content has disappeared from the web or is about to. If a trigger event occurs, then CLOCKSS opens the content from the dark archive and makes it available open access in perpetuity under a Creative Commons license where it's available to everyone. We have a dark archive containing quite a large amount of scholarly material at the minute. 46 million journal articles, 260,000 books. And increasingly, we're thinking about the infrastructure needed to keep those resources interconnected over time. So for example, we preserve things like cross-ref DOIs, and we are expanding the resource types that are preserved within CLOCKSS. So for example, software, data, enhanced books, and so forth. We try to make it very easy to deposit content into the archive if you are a publisher. And that can happen, for example, via file transfer or web harvesting. And it's usually pretty straightforward to set up if you're using OJS, for example. Okay, I just wanted to mention our approach to cost recovery for the service. We charge publishers an annual fee, which is based on publishing revenue. Plus there's a one-time setup fee that can be a bit higher if bespoke integration needs to be programmed, for example, for web harvesting, and it's usually at the lower end and pretty straightforward, for example, if you're using OJS. And then on an annual basis, there's also a fee for the amount of content that's ingested. You can see the prices here for journal articles and books. And if you are publishing a low volume of material, the initial articles or books are fee waived. If your university library is a CLOCKSS supporter, and that's voluntary for libraries, but if it is a library supporter, and we very much hope it is, then there's an additional discount available for university presses or library presses on the same campus. Okay, our governance. I've already stressed how important it is to us that this is a collaboration of libraries and publishers working together. And our board of directors reflects that half and half from each community. Our co-chairs right now are Mimi Coulter and Duncan Campbell from Wiley. So again, that principle of shared governance is reflected in the fact that we have a chair drawn from each community. We're funded by publisher fees that I've just outlined and voluntary contributions from libraries around the world. We're not for profit. We have a succession plan. So should anything happen to CLOCKSS, the content that we're preserving would continue to be made available in perpetuity. And we have a succession plan that involves the universities of Alberta, Edinburgh, Humboldt, and Stanford to provide that long-term sustainable access. Okay, our priorities for this year include adding further journal and book content to the archive. There's a long tail of publishers that we've yet to engage sufficiently with, and there are always back files and back issues that need to be found and preserved. We are fully aware that scholarship is changing as well, so we're keeping an active watching brief on new kinds of content and new types of users and uses at all times. Engaging with libraries is incredibly important to us, and it's a privilege to be here tonight with all of you and to be a new strategic affiliate partner of the Library Publishing Coalition. So really looking forward to learning from you and working with you and understanding how we can better support the library press community to engage in preservation activities. We're also increasingly looking for ways to reach out more broadly globally. We do have members around the world, but there are opportunities to strengthen our engagement in Asia Pacific and the Global South as well. And thanks to Craig's leadership, we're very actively involved in some projects now to look at how preservation services can work together to help minimize the risk of disappearing journals. So that's what I will talk about just for the remaining few minutes. So long-tail journals can be at risk of disappearing, particularly if their content isn't preserved in a trusted third-party archive of some kind. And so we're collaborating with other agencies and organizations very active in this space with the vision of creating a central hub into which smaller publishers can deposit their content, and from there it could be harvested very easily by an array of preservation services to be archived for perpetuity. The idea is to minimize costs and complexity and to really find a scalable way for many long-tail publishers to work with an array of archiving partners. Our first target content type for this project are Diamond OA journals. So as you all will be familiar with, these are open access journals that don't charge article processing charges and may rely very heavily on voluntary efforts from scholars, and which can be at some risk of disappearing. So the problems that we're trying to solve through this project and by working together across preservation services are outlined here. We don't want the important content in smaller scholar-led journals, for example, to disappear. We understand that there can be financial and technical barriers to their preservation at the minute. We want to lower those and make it easier. And we need to make it easy for preservation services as well to communicate clearly and effectively with literally thousands of small publishers around the world in many languages. So phase one of this project is to look at 7,500 Diamond OA journals that are indexed in the DOAJ, but that aren't currently archived. It's important as a starting point that they are indexed in DOAJ. That means that they have some identifiers, for example, an ISSN, and there's a vetting process. So we know that they're quality journals that are properly peer-reviewed and vetted, and so forth. It also is helpful in that many of the open access titles on DOAJ are already on the OJS platform, which makes it a little bit more practical, again, to develop the central repository and the channels between the different services. So we're gearing up to send a survey to the publishers of these journals and essentially finding out if they would like to be preserved. And if so, if they have a preference of which of the pilot partners to start with, or which range that they would like to work with. And our aim is for the deliverables to be not only preserving and archiving those 7,500 journals, but for the infrastructure to be scalable, with the goal of reducing the number of unarchived journals that are indexed in DOAJ and providing infrastructure that can be reused by other preservation services going forward. So really looking forward to that project, really looking forward to learning from you and listening to and working closely with the library publishing community. And I'll end there. Thank you very much on behalf of Craig and the entire CLOCKSS team for inviting us to participate tonight. And from here, I'll hand over to Jasmine.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. Yes, so I would like to switch focus a little bit now to a specific program that can be seen as a use case of some of the type of content that a recent program has, I guess, highlighted for CLOCKSS as potential type of content that they might be starting to preserve. So I'm going to talk about a program specifically that deals with the publication of digitally based monographs. So this program is Stanford University Press's Mellon-funded initiative for publishing fully web-based monographs. And like any university press, SUP is charged with publishing and disseminating the work of scholars in academia to aid in their tenure and promotion, and to generally ensure that the scholarly record is well vetted through peer review and dissemination. This program takes that traditional framework and applies it to the kinds of born digital projects that scholars are increasingly producing. But instead of asking scholars to write books about their digital research, we're supporting the presentation of that research and its arguments in its native digital form and context. So the program started in 2015. It's funded through mid-2022 by the Mellon Foundation, and we expect to be able to continue the program through some combination of university funding, endowments, and perhaps external grants as well. So we focus as a press on humanities, as a digital program on the humanities and social sciences. Both areas are consistent with the SUP lists in general. And my slides keep advancing strangely. Okay, sorry about that. But beyond the responsibility that presses have to coordinate the vetting of scholarly argument through peer review, as well as the dissemination of the scholarly record, authors rely on publishers and memory institutions to assure the publication's permanence in the scholarly record through persistent citability and access. So those are a couple of our objectives in our grant. It's more difficult with born digital projects, but there is an increasing demand as more publishers begin adopting these new formats to meet the needs of the scholars. So some other publishers that are dealing with this type of content include University of British Columbia Press and University of Washington Press in collaboration, University of Minnesota Press, Michigan Publishing, NYU Press. UVA Press now has a publication that is digitally based through programs like Brown and Emory, who are helping develop digital projects to be then paired with publishers that are working with this kind of content. But beyond university presses, libraries are also publishing and stewarding more of this type of content, whether formally or informally, because presses are still pretty limited to traditional publishing tools, structures, and workflows, whereas libraries tend to have more diverse areas of expertise for both the development support and the persistence of digital work. So they're taking on a lot of the responsibility of publishing this type of work. Our program aims to establish a parallel stream for scholarship that carries all of the heft and rigor of a typical monograph, but that allows scholars to employ the medium of the web. So these works rely on multimedia and the interactive and networked potentials of the web that surpass what is possible within the linear and textual bounds of the book. So these projects are not ebooks. They have no print equivalent. There is no PDF version of them. The content is always inextricable from the form. The argument is in fact embedded in the interaction between those two factors. And for our program and for many programs that are producing this kind of material, the content is open access. So it helps to see some examples. So this is Alicia Lebo's Filming Revolution. It's a meta documentary about documentary and independent filmmaking in Egypt since the 2011 revolution. Brings together the collective wisdom and creative strategies of media makers in Egypt before, during, and after the revolution. It compiles 30 original interviews with professional and amateur filmmakers and places them within a visual network of events, themes, and people. Another publication is Chinese Deathscape, which is an edited collection of essays dealing with the relocation of graves throughout China. It's led by Tom Mulliken. The project uses map data over time to locate and cite each grave that was moved and provide commentary on the circumstances surrounding these events. Each relocation is linked to a newspaper or other record source, and as the reader navigates the text, they are actually able to view the visual linkages between context and place. Okay, Constructing the Sacred utilizes 3D technologies to address ancient ritual landscape and examines the development specifically at the site of Saqqara, Egypt. The author, Elaine Sullivan, uses 3D to reveal how changes to sightlines, skylines, and vistas at different periods influenced sacred ceremonies and ritual meaning at the necropolis. So she's showing you're able to use a time slider to see how the landscape has changed across dynasties, what was built, what was covered, and how that then influenced the culture and how they celebrated and conducted their ceremonies. Our latest publication is Feral Atlas, which we're very excited about. It invites the readers to explore the ecological worlds created when non-human entities become tangled up with human infrastructure projects. So very timely. 79 field reports from scientists, humanists, and artists demonstrate how to recognize feral ecologies, that is ecologies that have been encouraged by human-built infrastructures, but which have developed and spread beyond human control. These effects, the project argues, are the Anthropocene. So the project catalogs sites of imperial and industrial ruin and stretches conventional notions of maps and mapping, drawing on relational potential of the digital to offer new ways of analyzing and then apprehending that Anthropocene. As you can see, coronavirus is a key player in all of this too. So those are just 4 of the 7 publications that we currently have out since the beginning of this program. We have several more in the pipeline. There are 2 that are coming into production in late summer. And yes, there will be a poll in just a second. You may see like some familiar aspects to these projects that I just showed. Maybe similar types of projects are being produced by faculty at your institution, or go back. Or maybe artists and scholars at your centers are working on similar types of projects. So I'd like to just get an idea of what types of projects, whether similar to these or not, you guys are dealing with. So if we could activate that next poll, thank you. So the question is, does your institution or organization develop, support, and or publish any of the following types? Right. Okay. All right, looks like a good number of responses indicate that you are working on a lot of these types of projects, or some or all of the above. So digital scholarships, digital research tools and data, digital course material, etc. And 3 responses for hope to. Good. Well, if you are working on any of these here, I'm going to do the stop. Do I click the stop sharing? Okay, thank you. Okay. If you are working with any of this stuff, then you already know that in addition to the previously mentioned, these characteristics, these projects tend to, or this content tends to be dependent on, have dependencies and resist archiving. So for our projects, they're being web-based, they're obviously dependent on server and browser technologies, both aspects that we have no control over as a press. These things will change, servers will change, browsers will change, and the stuff sitting on them will need to be adapted or frozen somehow to allow continued access. So archiving then is a must, but it's also very challenging. So we found that a kind of balance during development between innovation for a lot of these authors. They want to use new technologies. They want to be able to make use of the tools that are out there to help present their arguments in the most effective ways. But we also need to balance that with the sustainability and the preservability of that content and those arguments. We're working on then developing editorial workflows for the large groups of people who are often involved in the development of these projects. Having authors and their developers work in tandem with the press and the editors here to ensure that they're developing things that we can support in the long term. That often involves adapting existing models to new forms, while also trying to help influence what new models are being built. So persistence and preservation is obviously especially hard. Why are these projects so hard to preserve? Well, because the content and the form are really inextricable, but the tools that we have usually focus on one at the expense of the other. So in order to preserve the text of a project, we ultimately need to end up stripping that text from its context, removing any linkages to visual or multimodal aspects. We could also preserve the underlying code for these projects, but when we do that, we're often disaggregating it again, code files from the presentation context. And so we're adapting and overlapping existing solutions for both types of preservation and trying to make them work together. Ultimately, these projects are in ways ephemeral. They're like performances. And so some of our preservation approaches model the preservation approaches used for documenting performance, which often includes screencasts, things like that. So I could go a bit more into production challenges, but and we can talk about that in Q&A if there's time, if anyone is interested in that aspect of things, but I really want to focus more on preservation. So all the work that goes into editing really, and development and marketing and all the things that happen at a press is really of no use without some promise of persistence for the audience. So we can break it down into 3 phases where this focus plays out. In the pre-publication phase, so in the development of the project itself, which can take for our program anywhere from 2 to 4 years, but a lot of scholars are working on their digital projects for a lot longer than that before they come to us. The publication phase, which starts at the moment that it's released to as long as it will live on the live web. And then during the post-publication phase, obviously, we're actively focused on preservation during all the phases, but post-publication is when it becomes super important. When the publication no longer lives on the web, how is it going to be able to be presented to researchers? And we held a workshop early on in our program where we actually invited authors to discuss some of these preservation issues. And one of the questions was, how long do you expect or want your digital publication to live online? And the answers are surprisingly varied. We had authors who only cared about it lasting as long as they needed it for achieving tenure. Some of them wanted to at least have it last through their lifetime. Some of them understood the ephemerality of what they were producing and almost honored that as part of its characteristic, and saw that, once it's dead, let it die. And then others were sort of like, well, it depends, what parts are you talking about? So for the filming revolution example, the interviews with the filmmakers, of course, are sort of at the heart of it. So another author who was documenting a completely oral language wanted to make sure that the performances he recorded of the poems were the thing that was kept. And he didn't necessarily care about his scholarship living forever. He just wanted those things to be archived in perpetuity. So the question is really open-ended, and depending who you talk to, there's going to be different points of focus for what needs to be preserved and for how long. But ultimately, as the press publishing them, we want to ensure that we're doing our part to provide access for as long as possible. So one of the things that was really valued and continues to be valued, not just at the workshop, but it came up at the workshop, and it continues to be one of our main goals is open access. But then the cost of open access really changes when you're accounting for the life cycle. It's much different from print. One of the earlier poll questions revealed that Amazon was a solution for preservation. And I'm not sure if this was the same context, but I mean, I've heard presses talk about Amazon itself being the way that their books are preserved. If you need a copy of it, you just order it from Amazon, and that's the preservation. So obviously, like when you're responsible for the distribution of a web publication, where at the press, as we're hosting it, we want to provide access continually. We're the ones kind of on the hook for ensuring it's available. So that becomes expensive, obviously. So if you guys have experience with this, I would like to know as well, and kind of what everyone else is doing. So this is yet another poll moment. The question here is, if your institution or organization supports the development or publication of digital work, what kinds of contingencies for longevity or preservation are in place now? Okay. Looks like one of the groups are answering that they are taking on data storage, so static preservation, often a repository, and also support for hosting, which is I'm glad to see that. Partnering with outside preservation agencies. I should say I'm glad to say that because I know now that we're not the only ones doing that. Okay. Great. Thank you for sharing that. That's really helpful. And I'm going to say, I just close that. So all of these approaches to preservation, obviously, as I was saying before, have to happen at different stages, but they have to be a consideration at every single stage of development, if possible. So I wanted to focus in a little bit, just briefly, on those three stages. For what we're doing for pre-publication, we are essentially providing a guidelines package to authors that that explains, well, it helps basically to mitigate the issues that we're going to have later. Whoops. Full result just popped up again for me. So to keep a certain restraint on the limitless potentials of web-based formats, we've built an entire set of technical guidelines and recommendations to guide authors to developing their projects with durability or preservation in mind. And the recommendations have become the first intervention toward assuring that the work authors are producing is something that we are able to support and preserve given the resources that we have. But as technologies evolve, we need to revise and update these recommendations, and with the extended workflow usually involved in the development of these projects and finally publishing them, by the time they're released, the guidelines version that they may have even been using could be outdated. So it's something that is constantly evolving. We're also essentially preserving the project as we're hosting it. So once the project is released, it's already undergone some editing based on the migration process. We've had to change some things in the coding to work in our environment, in our hosting environment. So once it's in our environment, then we've ensured that we are able to support it for, you know, as long as we possibly can. Most websites, most web content, they say typically lasts 3 to 5 years. Of course, we're doing things in the back end to provide as many updates and things as we can to the code itself and the technologies to ensure that that content stays online longer. But you know, at some point, updating and repairing can only go so far, and the content will just no longer be viable on certain browsers and things. So we'll need to transition to an archived version, which at that point will already be ready. And to mitigate all of those moving parts, we do have one thing that's constant, which is the cover page. Every page has this static maintained cover page. And within a year of publication, we add a link to the archive material. So we have like, we do a web archive, we preserve the bits in Stanford Digital Repository, and then we provide documentation. So those are the post-publication things that we're looking at. We've outlined an approach that basically uses Web Recorder right now for web archiving. We are involved with the EASY, the Emulation as a Service infrastructure pilot program, and we're also utilizing our institutional repository for preserving the bits. I won't spend too long on these. Actually, I want to skip to something else before time is up. I'll just say that web archiving seems to create the most parallel experience of using this or reading the site on the live web. So a web archive will have all of those interactions and things that you would experience if you were browsing a project on the web. And CLOCKSS, Portico, these preservation partners that are engaging with this type of content are already using web archiving as one of their solutions. Stanford Digital Repository, of course, is a institutional digital repository where we're able to take advantage of that connection between the library and the press to preserve the code and the files, multimedia, and all of that. Again, emulation is another strategy that we are exploring and testing. It involves making disk images of a project and then spinning it up in an emulator. So similar somewhat to the way people are able to experience old Nintendo games or something now. So the challenges, again, I've already shown this slide, but libraries have tools and infrastructure and resources for sure, more so even than presses themselves do. But even with all of their resources, I mean, libraries need to apply their own solutions. So our press's three-pronged approach to those three preservation strategies really relies on a combination of library service infrastructure and outside partners. But in traditional publishing, there are already services specifically designed for publishers' content to allay the need for pulling together and even repurposing solutions for preservation. Services like CLOCKSS, as I mentioned, and Portico work specifically to centralize this process. So in 2019, we joined in a grant, the Enhancing Services to Preserve New Forms of Scholarship program. It began as an opportunity to explore the potential of these outside services to expand their tools to address these new kinds of formats. So the presses that were included are some of the same ones I mentioned earlier. And then the preservation partners that were involved were CLOCKSS and Portico. The idea was to help ensure the preservation of complex new forms of digital scholarship. Thank you. I'll just go ahead and skip, yes. So SUP contributed and prepared some test cases to the preservation partners so that they could apply these solutions that they were using or continuing to develop. So for Chinese Deskscape, as I showed earlier, one of the main challenges was the external data. And the CLOCKSS side focused on this project simply because it did have that external data, and the tools they were already using for web harvesting and web archiving seems to really fit this type of content. So Tib, who was working on this project at CLOCKSS, he ended up actually having, or he didn't have to do this, but he noted that this is what it would take to actually preserve this content. There would be millions to tens of millions of items to fetch and gather from OpenStreetMaps, which is what this project was using for its maps. And that scale is just, it's way out of scope for the typical type of workflow that these preservation groups are dealing with. So, I mean, it indicates to us that, you know, we as the press have to have certain limitations around what it just brings up that idea again of balancing innovation versus preservability. So the other thing that we learned from this was that there are different web archiving tools, and they handle JavaScript differently. So for instance, in one system, some of the executed script had to be rewritten so that it, in the project, so that it could actually be captured. The way that different web archiving tools replay the content is different. So on the right side, you can see this is what the Wayback Machine does with one of our projects. And on the left, this is what Web Recorder does with our project. So the one on the left, obviously, is the correct one. So that one works. We also learned that for emulation, we needed to prepare a disk image, and then we had to anonymize the data in the database. So when there was user data involved, we first had to clean that out so that the disk image didn't include that sensitive data when it was preserved and living in its preserved emulated mode. In Filming Revolution, which you saw demonstrated earlier, it relies on a Vimeo API. So we actually needed to rewrite that to just be able to serve HTML video. So we were sort of changing in a way the project's code to be able to serve the web, the disk image locally. Again, these are just all of the web archiving tools that are out there right now. They're not all built the same. It matters which one you're using, depending on the type of content and code that you're using. And then I will just say that this project has, although it has wrapped up, they're still in they're still in report writing stage. There are possibly guidelines and recommendations for publishers and authors that will be a key outcome. The next project is being considered to test out the recommendations, and there will be a presentation tomorrow during the same time slot, I noticed, a session where they will be talking about that project. So that is the end. I think I went over considerably, so I won't pontificate much on my concluding points. I'll just say that it's encouraging that library publishers and presses are already joining a lot of these kind of preservation communities to look at the content versus what's available in terms of tools to preserve it. So thank you very much.